Let's now talk about the muscular system. Many muscles attach to bones, and when contracting, they move the body around. And those are the skeletal muscles, since they attract to the bones, the skeletal system. They also hold the body up against gravity by pulling on those bones. And those then help with posture, holding us up. And so that helps with, instead of slouching, the muscles just hold us up. They don't necessarily move us. Internally, it's muscles that make the heart pump when contracting, and we call that cardiac muscles. In the picture up here, we see how we move the forearm and bend it, and then how here we stretch it out. And down here, as you can see, that's a heart muscle depicted there. Muscles around organs and tubes help in digestion by moving the food forward. And those are smooth muscles. And you can see that depicted in this layer right in here, this central layer, usually in a tube, is the muscular layer. They also dilate and constrict airways to modulate the amount of air ventilating the lungs. And so that means dilating, and restriction is opening or closing them. In blood vessels, this helps direct blood to the tissues that need it most. Muscles around the bladder contract when we're peeing. And so that's an example of a hollow organ that has muscle in it that also works with it and contracts it when we go to the bathroom. Skeletal muscle control body movements. And we can do that as in moving forward, as in locomotion, or also when we move objects around. We can intentionally control their movements, and so we have conscious control over them. So we can have it's a voluntary muscle, we call them, because we can use our willpower to move them around. A muscle is made of many muscle fibers that span the entire muscle length. And those are all individual cells. And they are long. They are the entire muscle length. So they develop when embryonic cells that are smaller fuse together. And that then is the reason why skeletal muscles have multiple nuclei in them. And they're the only muscle type that do that. And you can see here in the picture, this is an entire muscle here. And this piece here, that's one cell, one muscle cell, and that spans the entire length of the muscle. Muscle fibers then bundle to form fascicles, which are surrounded by a connective tissue sheath. And the collection of those then forms a muscle. And you can see, so here is the little one, the one cell. And then when some of them group together, they form a fascicle. And that's a fascicle. And that white layer here that you can see on top, that shiny thing, that's that muscle sheath or a fascicle sheath here. And is known as the perimysium. We don't worry about the words too much, more about how it works in this class. But then a multiple of those together, you can see that in this bigger piece here, and then that's the entire muscle right in here. That's what they form. And then that muscle has another sheath on top of it. And look, that has a name too. That name stuck here. It's known as the epimysium. But again, don't worry about remembering the names. I'm interested in you understanding how it works mostly. And then all those sheaths come together at the end of the muscle here, and they form they anchor the whole muscle into the bone right in here, and that's then known as a tendon. That white part here, that's not really contractile tissue, that's more like anchoring cables to anchor the muscle into the bone. So those are the tendons. And then this system here, this transfers the forces from the muscle into the bone when we are moving around and when we're moving the bone around. Very interesting. Microscopically, lengthwise positioned protein threads look striated. And that's a little hard to see, but you can sort of make out here how you have a little darker here, and then you have a little lighter right next to it. And so that's meant by that striated appearance. And those threads are of two different kinds, and they are known as the thick and the thin filaments. And when the thick filament attach to the thin ones and pull on them, a muscle contracts. And that's basically how that works. It's kind of a tug of war situation. Like one holds the other one and pulls on it, and then that shortens the muscle over time. Or it shortens it because so many of these muscle cells are doing it. Smooth muscle is around hollow organs and tubes, and they look like spindles. They don't show striations, and those muscles are not consciously controlled. And you can see that here, how one of those looks like a spindle right in here. So you that one right there. And cardiac muscle is specific to the heart and not under conscious control as well. It shows striations and also intercalated discs, and those contain gap junctions. And you can see that right here. You see that blue arrow going to that white stripe right next to it, and that's that's an intercalated disc that connects a cardiac muscle cell to the next one, and then in it is that gap junction. And as we learned previously, the gap junction allows the ions, the nerve impulse, to travel through all the muscle cells at once and make that entire heart contract as a whole unit. That functional syncytium that we talked about in the previous chapter when we talked about the heart. So that's really cool. So that's the three muscle types. And let's now go a little bit more into the skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle cells contract when prompted by a nerve impulse. And so we have then some specialized structures that facilitate both the nerve impulse going through the muscle, so it can contract as a whole unit as well as one muscle. And also, of course, we have specialized organelles or structures or those threads, those filaments that then do the contraction of the muscle. The sarcolemma is the outside cell membrane, and it can transmit an electrical impulse that spreads across the entire muscle. So that's one of those specialized structures. And you can see that right here, that thing that flips back here, that's the sarcolemma. That's the cell membrane that can transmit a nerve impulse. Myofibrils contain the two thready proteins. And let me go back to this real quick. You can see here, this entire structure, the entire structure is a muscle cell. And then one of those long things here is a myofibril. So as you can see, it's interesting. The muscle goes from, where was that? It goes from large muscle to fascicle to muscle fiber. And then actually here you can see those little dots here too. Those are the myofibrils. So it goes from smaller to smaller to smaller. And then of course that makes sense, because if these small myofibrils then are the ones that do the contraction and everything gets bigger as a whole, the muscle can really exude some force and is very strong. The strength comes in numbers, right? It's that kind of thing. So those myofibrils contain the two thready proteins, and we have the thick filament and the thin filament. And you can see them right in here. You can see the thick filament here, and you can see they have these heads. And we call that the myosin. And that's the myosin head. And then we have the thin filament, and the thin filament is known as the actin molecule. The actin has this little thread going on top of it. And what that thread does, it covers over the side called the active side, which is where that head down here then attaches to when we have a muscle contraction. The myosin and the actin surround each other, and then the myosin head, as I said before, have those movable heads that attach to the actin, and then those movable heads, and you can see that indicated here, they can move. That's why they're movable. But when they move and are attached to the actin at the same time, they move the actin past them, and that shortens the muscle. That's the whole trick of the whole thing. And so here's written out: when the head moves, it pulls on the actin, which shortens the myofibril, and that requires ATP, and that contracts the muscle. And so look, here's actually pictured. So you can see in step one how the myosin head is attached to the actin, and then it does that flipping back motion, and that moves the actin in this direction, and then an ATP attaches to it, and that detaches the head and puts it back into a power position, which is that upward position that then can reattach and do the whole thing again. And so that is what a muscle contraction looks like on a microscopic level. And then we also have one more element that plays with it, because the muscle contraction, that head moving, is the active part. But I said before, we have that little thread here, and that thread can be over this black part. Oops, sorry, I'm a little shaky. That thread can be over these black dots, and that's the active sites. And when it's covering the active site, the myosin head cannot attach to it, and at that point, the muscle does not contract. And so the control of if the active site is covered or not is by calcium. And I can push forward here a little bit, and you can see that here a little better depicted. You can see here's that actin is the blue, and you can see that thready that covers the black dots, and here those black dots are freed up. And so that's when that thread is removed. And that thread removes itself when calcium is present. And so the calcium ion binds to it and moves that thread away and of the active side, and then the myosin heads can attach. And so that's kind of interesting, because that makes this a two-step process, this muscle contraction. Like the myosin head can be ready to go, and as soon as we just move that thread away from the active side, all these myosins can contract. And so that's kind of interesting because of that. And so we have this specialized structure that holds the calcium and releases the calcium as soon as a nerve impulse tells it to do so, as soon as that activates it. And so the nerve impulse from the sarcolemma comes down, and if we can visualize that here, it comes down these yellow tubes, and we call these the T tubules. And then right next to it, we have those blue parts here, these blue baggy structures. And these are actually originally endoplasmic reticulum in the normal cells, but then in the muscle cells, they develop into what we call now the sarcoplasmic reticulum. And so those are right here. And those hold the calcium. And when the nerve impulse comes down through the muscle, then the calcium is released into the muscle fiber and can do the trickery right in here and move that thread so the myosin head can attach. And when that happens, we can have that nerve impulse happening. I mean, we can have that muscle contraction happening by the myosin head attaching to the actin and pulling on it. So that's pretty neat, isn't it? Look at that. And that brings us to the muscles. So we'll talk about those muscles in the next video.